My name is Meredith Thatcher, 35 years old. The morning I got married, my father stood blocking the doorway of my childhood church. He looked me dead in the eye, dropping every word ice cold, and told me he would not walk me down that aisle. The reason, because my groom was, in his exact words, not one of us. He told me to walk alone. To chew on what I had done to this family, I looked at him. My hand slowly slipped off his arm. I stood there, waiting for the music to swell. And when those heavy oak doors burst open, I did not walk alone. The man who took my arm that day was someone my father had not looked at in 30 years. What my father did at that church door in front of the entire town is the exact reason he will spend the rest of his life explaining a name he pretended to forget for 3 decades. And you know what? I never raised my voice at him. Not even once. Let me take you back to the fateful Tuesday. I decided to tell my family I was engaged. I was living in the city, then a little over 2 hours from the farm I grew up on. I work as a hospice nurse. That means I sit right next to people who are stepping into the final room of their lives. Doing this work, you learn things no school ever teaches. You learn what people truly regret. Almost nobody regrets the truths they told. They regret the truths they swallowed, the apologies that never left their lips, the doors they callously slammed shut. Theo and I had been together for 4 years. He is a large animal veterinarian, the kind of man who could talk a panicked 1,000-pound bull down from a frenzy, and then come home and tear up over a television commercial. That Sunday, I brought Theo home for dinner. I thought a meal was the fairest way to start. Let them meet a flesh and blood man. Not some preconceived notion. My father shook Theo's hand. It was the dismissive, limp handshake you give a peddler when you have already decided you are not buying. Dale, my older brother, dodged Theo's eyes, muttering something about the weather. My mother set out the gold-rimmed plates reserved for holidays and funerals, smiling with her mouth but defensive in her eyes, halfway through the roast. Dale's phone rang. One of his heifers was down in the pasture, bloated, in real trouble. Theo set his napkin down. Mind if I take a look? He rushed out into the field in his crisp dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands moving with precision. He found the blockage, guided Dale through it, and saved the animal. And he absolutely never acted like a savior. Theo walked back into the kitchen, smelling like the barn. He washed his hands at the sink like a man who had belonged in this house for years. My mother watched him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. But my father did not. He just stared, not a single word. Then he speared a piece of meat. Without even looking up from his plate, he growled, "Where is he from?" Exactly. The room went so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the wall clock and the wind whistling through the screen door. I spoke up to defend Theo, but my father just coldly threw out the words I will carry for the rest of my life. He is not one of us. The entire kitchen held its breath. He turned and looked me right in the eye. For the first time all evening, "You want to marry him? Go ahead, but do it without me. Walk yourself in and think long and hard about what you are doing to this family. Theo did not flinch. He did not shrink away. He just slipped his hand under the table and gripped mine, warm, steady. The way he calms a frightened animal. I looked at my father. A strange calm washed over me. The kind of calm you feel when the monster you have always feared finally steps into the daylight. All right, Dad, I said, then I will find someone else to walk me. At that moment, I had no idea who that someone would be. That same week, Earl Hollis became my patient, 84 years old, congestive heart failure, a slow goodbye that I knew how to make less painful. Earl had been the records clerk down at the county courthouse for over 30 years. The man holding the black and white papers that dictated who ultimately owned what. One afternoon, while I was changing his sheets, he looked at me for a long time with cloudy eyes. You are Carl's girl. You favor your grandmother a lot. You favor Vera. I smiled and thanked him, but his smile drifted away somewhere. I knew that farm back when there were 2 brothers on it. He whispered, your grandmother never got what she asked for, not in her final days, and I had a hand in it. At first, I thought it was the rambling of a dying man, but it was not. With the last of his strength, he told me to open the bottom drawer and pull out a yellowed folder. Inside was a copy of my grandmother's will. She left the farm to both of her sons, split down the middle, every word clear as day, and clipped right behind it was a quitclaim deed signed in 1996. Uncle Eli's trembling handwriting, signing away his entire half of the land to my father for practically nothing. The date on it was 3 weeks before my grandmother died, when she was already in a coma and could not even sit up. I filed papers that I knew in my bones were wrong. Earl cried. Your dad brought Eli to my office. Eli was grieving, terrified, and full of guilt. Your dad told Eli it was their mother's dying wish to keep the peace, but it was a blatant lie. Vera's real will was sitting right there in my drawer. My head spun. 1996. I was 4 years old. That was the year Uncle Eli was kicked out of the house. My family always whispered that he had abandoned us to chase after a black woman named Loretta, breaking my grandmother's heart. My father called him a traitor. He is not one of us. My father always ended the story with that line, but that was not the truth. He did not betray anyone. He was robbed, and then he was erased. 2 days later, I drove across 2 counties and pulled up to Uncle Eli's porch. He gave a small nod when he heard my request, but Aunt Loretta, the woman who had waited 30 years for the truth to see the light, placed her hand over his Eli. Her voice rang out, firm and heavy. The girl asked you a question. Do not make her ask it twice. Fast forward to the wedding rehearsal. My father showed up purely to assert his dominance in front of the pastor and the neighbors. When the pastor asked who would be walking the bride, my father stood up abruptly. I have made my position perfectly clear He intentionally projected his voice so the whole hall could hear. I will have no part in this. You want to walk down there with your ridiculous decision. Then you walk alone. He slammed the door and left. The harsh echo rattled through the sanctuary. My mother cornered me in the parking lot when we were alone. She was crying. I am begging you, Meredith, do not bring Eli into that church tomorrow. Your father will not survive the humiliation. If you do this, you will destroy this family. And it will be your fault. The same old trick, forcing women to bear the consequences of men's sins. I looked straight at her. I almost screamed that I knew about the will, that she had known everything and was complicit in hiding it. But I just said, Mom, I am not breaking this family. It broke in 1996. You all just learned to step around the wreckage. The morning of the wedding, the church was packed. The organ swelled, playing my grandmother's favorite hymn. When the massive doors opened, the light poured in. My father stood at the front pew, smug and victorious. He was absolutely certain I would either break down or walk down the aisle in shame. But the silhouette in the doorway was not one person. It was two Uncle Eli in a tailored charcoal suit, stood tall and proud, offering me his arm. The entire church froze. A whisper swept through the pews like wind through a cornfield. Is that Eli Thatcher? And Utman gasped. My father launched out of his pew like he was possessed. His face flushed deep red, his finger pointing straight at his brother's face. He is not one of us. He has not set foot here in 30 years. He has no right to be here. He screamed, those four bitter words echoing again. I did not argue back. I have learned that when you lower your voice, people start listening to the truth. Instead of watching two fools argue, in that dead silence, Aunt Ruth stood up from the second row, unwavering. Then the pastor's wife, then old man Whitfield, and old Biddle. People stood up, not out of anger, but to bear witness, until my father was the only one standing for the wrong reason, surrounded by a church full of people standing up for the right one. I looked at him, my voice low, but crystal clear. You told me to walk alone and think about what I have done. I thought about it, and I decided not to, but the lethal blow did not land until the reception. My father still would not back down. He cornered Uncle Eli, sneering in front of the old neighbors. You came back for the land. Did you not? 30 years. And you show your face to steal back the farm. I know exactly how you operate. I reached into my bag and pulled out Earl's yellowed folder. I did not slam it on the table. I did not make a scene like some television lawyer. I just set it down. The copy of the will, the fraudulent quitclaim deed, the court notes. I rested my hand on top of it, turning it into an undeniable fact. Uncle Eli looked at the folder, then at his younger brother. I never came back for the dirt. Carl, I came back for her. And for any kid who was ever cut off just because they were told they were not one of us. In the corner of the room, Dale's face turned the color of skim milk. He understood all too well what an unadministered will and a clouded property title would do to the massive farm expansion loan he had just signed. Old man Whitfield looked at the folder, then at my father. Carl, is that Vera's will? My father was speechless. For the first time in his life, standing among people who had known him for 40 years, he could not form a single word, watching his fake empire of authority crumble. I did not feel triumphant. I just felt empty. The oppressive ghost of my childhood was, in the end, just a coward, trembling next to a coffee urn. Monday morning, the lawyer filed the petition to reopen my grandmother's estate. The bank immediately froze Dale's loan. My father had kept the land for 30 years by silencing everyone, but he could not survive 30 minutes once the right question was asked in the middle of a church. Family, I finally realized, is not about the people who share your bloodline or your dirt. Family is the door you choose to keep open. And the people who walk through it to reach you, even when someone else is screaming at them to get out. My father told me to walk alone. In return, the entire congregation taught him the true meaning of the word us.